They didn't bulldoze the trees first. They bulldozed the graves. My great-grandmother's grave, erased in a single night. While we slept and while we trusted, while we believed that a word like perpetuity actually meant something in this country, I stood at the edge of that torn earth on a Thursday, morning in July, diesel, smoke still hanging in the air. The iron cross that had marked Ida Mae Okafor's grave for 70 years, bent, half buried in fresh-turned clay, 20 feet from where it had stood since before I was born, and Margaret Hollis was standing near the tree line with her clipboard. She saw me coming. She did not move. She smiled. That smile, warm, patient, absolutely certain. The smile of a woman who had spent 9 years making problems disappear and had never once faced a consequence for any of it. She said, "The board had full authority over this area, Mr. Okafor." I looked at that bent iron cross in the dirt. I looked at her, and I made her a promise she didn't take seriously. She should have taken it seriously. My name is Darnell Okafor, retired electrician. 28 years, quiet man, the kind of man who waves at neighbors and never asks for trouble. But here is what I need you to understand before this story goes any further. Ida Mae Okafor survived sharecropping, survived the Great Migration, survived every system this country built to erase people like her. She came north from Georgia with $11, a Bible, and 2 children, and she built something that lasted. Margaret Hollis bulldozed it for a sand trap. What would you do? Drop it in the comments, because what I did next took 18 months, 1 FBI civil rights investigator, 2 federal attorneys, and 1 very cold Tuesday morning outside the Allegheny County Federal Courthouse. And it was worth every single day. Let me take you back to the beginning. Pinecrest Fairways sat on the western edge of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Rolling hills, old-growth oaks, that particular smell of pine, resin and wet clay that settles into the air after a summer rain and makes you feel like the world still has some goodness left in it. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect in a brochure. And like most things that look perfect in a brochure, the fine print told a very different story. My name is Darnell Okafor. I moved to Pinecrest in the spring of 2018 with my wife, Celestine, and our teenage son, Marcus. I had spent 28 years as an electrician, commercial work, hospital buildings, government contracts across 3 states. Celestine was a retired school nurse. Marcus was 16, quiet, good with his hands, already talking about trade school. We were not looking for trouble. We were looking for a yard with a garden bed, a porch where Celestine could drink her morning coffee without hearing traffic, a neighborhood where Marcus could ride his bike without us holding our breath. Pinecrest gave us all of that. What Pinecrest also gave us was Margaret Hollis. Margaret had been HOA board president for 9 consecutive years. She ran unopposed every single cycle, not because residents loved her, but because running against her meant becoming her target, and nobody wanted that. Margaret was the kind of woman who sent violation notices for the angle of your welcome mat, who arrived at community meetings 40 minutes early to rearrange the chairs, and then rearrange them again after anyone else touched them, who had a laminated binder with color-coded tabs and the quiet absolute certainty of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. She drove a white Cadillac, always clean, always parked perfectly straight. She wore blazers to Saturday morning meetings like she was preparing to testify before Congress, and she smiled, and constantly. The warm, patient smile of a woman who had decided long ago that this neighborhood was her kingdom and every resident in it was simply a subject who hadn't fully accepted that fact yet. I did not like her the first time I met her. I want to be honest about that. She knocked on our door 4 days after we moved in. Celestine offered her coffee. Margaret declined, opened her binder, and informed us in the gentle corrective tone of a woman explaining something obvious, that our porch chairs were 2 inches past the approved setback line, that my work van was not permitted in the main lot overnight, and that the wind chime Celestine had hung by the front door was, and I am quoting directly, potentially inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The wind chime had been a gift from Celestine's mother. I moved it inside. I was tired from the move. I was still grieving the old neighborhood. I did not yet understand that every concession I made, Margaret recorded in that binder as a permanent victory. I would not make that mistake again. But the Pinecrest Fairways brochure, did not mention and what Margaret Hollis certainly never volunteered, and was the small private cemetery sitting at the far northeastern corner of the property, tucked behind a dense wall of old hemlock trees. 12 graves, the oldest dating back to 1897. They belonged to 3 families who had worked this land long before any developer ever looked at these Pennsylvania hills and saw a golf course. The Whitmore family, the Calloway family, and 1 grave, standing slightly apart from the others, marked with a small iron cross and the name Ida May Okafor, my great-grandmother. Ida May had come north from Georgia in 1921 during the Great Migration. $11, a Bible, 2 children. She had worked the Whitmore farm for 32 years, through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through every hard season this Pennsylvania clay could deliver. When she passed in 1954, the Whitmore family buried her on their land with full honors beside their own. When the property sold to a developer in 1971, the deed included a restriction recorded with Allegheny County in plain language. Those graves were to remain undisturbed in perpetuity. I had known about Ida May's grave my entire life. My father brought me here as a child. We would park on the access road, walk quietly through the hemlocks, and stand for a few minutes without speaking. He never explained much. He never needed to. Some things pass between a father and a son without words. After we moved to Pinecrest, I visited regularly. I kept the iron cross clean. I left flowers twice a year, once in March on her birthday, once on the first Sunday of November. Margaret knew the graves were there. I know this because 18 months later, during legal discovery, her own emails confirmed she had commissioned a private title search in January of 2022, specifically to determine whether the deed restriction was enforceable. Her own attorney told her in writing that it was. She proceeded anyway. The board meeting where the demolition was approved lasted 9 minutes. It was scheduled at 6:45 in the morning. It appeared in the monthly newsletter as Item 7B, Northeast Quadrant Landscaping Initiative. No photographs, no site maps, no mention of graves, no mention of deed restrictions, no mention of the 3 families whose ancestors were buried in that corner. 4 board members voted yes. Margaret voted yes. The contractor arrived on a Wednesday night in late July. I found out Thursday morning when my neighbor Calvin called just after 6. His voice so unsteady I asked him to repeat himself 3 times. I drove to the northeast corner and stepped out of my truck. The hemlocks were stumps. The iron fence was crushed into a scrap pile near the tree line. Bent at angles, that metal only bends when something very large moves through it without slowing down. The graves were gone. All 12. Fresh turned earth stretched across the entire corner, the color of brick dust, cracked at the surface the way deeply, disturbed ground cracks and like something wounded trying to close itself. The smell was immediate, diesel exhaust, overturned clay, that sharp mineral scent of earth that had been untouched for decades and did not welcome the interruption. I stood there for a long time. Then I looked at the iron cross lying bent in the dirt. Ida May Okafor. I took out my phone. I did not call a lawyer. I called my daughter Simone, 29 years old, civil rights attorney, Washington, D.C. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I was looking at. 4 seconds of silence. Then, don't touch anything. Don't move anything. I am getting in my car right now. Simone arrived at Pinecrest at 2 in the afternoon. She did not hug me when she got out of the car. She looked at the site for 30 seconds, pulled out her phone and started photographing everything. The stumps, the twisted iron fence, the fresh turned earth, the bent iron cross still lying in the clay where the backhoe had left it. She was wearing a gray blazer and flat shoes, and the particular expression she had, inherited directly from her mother, calm, focused, the look of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply executing the steps in order. She turned to me after 15 minutes. "Dad, this is a federal matter." I already knew, but hearing it out loud, standing on that torn ground, felt different. "Here is something worth knowing, and I want you to actually look this up for your own state because this law exists in various forms, everywhere, and almost nobody uses it. Under the Civil Rights Act and subsequent federal case law, the deliberate destruction of a black family's burial site, particularly one protected by a recorded deed restriction, can constitute a violation of federally protected property rights. When there is documented evidence that the decision-maker had prior knowledge of the restriction and proceeded anyway, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has investigative jurisdiction. Simone had already drafted the complaint in her head during the 4-hour drive. She filed it the following Monday morning. The FBI field office in Pittsburgh assigned Special Agent Darius Webb to the case within the week. Agent Webb was tall, methodical early 40s, with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that patience was not slowness, it was pressure applied, quietly over time. He walked the site for 3 hours. He collected soil samples. He photographed the deed restriction documents I had pulled from the Allegheny County Recorder's office myself the same morning. I found the destruction. He asked me one question before he left. Mr. Okafor, did she know? I handed him a printed copy of Margaret's email to her contractor dated January 14, 2022. The one where she wrote, and I am reading this exactly. Confirm the northeast corner can be cleared without legal exposure. Title search attached. Agent Webb read it once. He looked up. He said, "We'll be in touch." Margaret's response was immediate and predictable. She retained a real estate attorney named Charles Pruitt, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of man who charges by the quarter, hour, and makes you feel the clock running when he shakes your hand. Charles filed a motion arguing the deed restriction had been abandoned through non-enforcement over 5 decades and carried no current legal weight. It was a real argument, technically constructed, just plausible enough to be dangerous. Simone demolished it in 11 pages. Under Pennsylvania case law and federal cemetery protection statutes, deed restrictions protecting burial grounds do not expire through non-enforcement. The legislature had specifically exempted cemetery restrictions from abandonment doctrine. You cannot bulldoze a graveyard and then argue nobody stopped you fast enough. The motion was denied in 4 days. Judge Patricia Ellison's ruling was 3 paragraphs. The final sentence noted that the respondent's legal theory was, and I am quoting the actual ruling, inconsistent with both the governing statutes and basic standards of human decency. Simone read me that sentence over the phone. We were both quiet for a moment. Then Margaret made the mistake that broke everything open. Facing federal investigation, a denied motion in a neighborhood that had finally started asking questions she couldn't answer, and she called an emergency board meeting, 5 members only. No community notice. 6:45 in the morning again, because that was her move when she needed something done before anyone could object. She authorized $60,000 from the HOA reserve fund for additional legal defense, $60,000 from dues paid by 41 families to defend the woman who destroyed their neighbor's great-grandmother's grave. Roland Faber had been on the board for 3 years. Quiet accountant. Had voted yes to things he shouldn't have voted yes to because Margaret had a way of making disagreement feel more expensive than compliance. But $60,000 was the number that finally cost more than his silence was worth. He forwarded the meeting minutes to Simone that same afternoon. Simone found the number that changed everything. The HOA reserve fund had been receiving $15,000 annually in maintenance fees for 4 consecutive years. The balance should have been $60,000. The actual balance was $4,100. $56,000 had gone somewhere. The only person with signature authority on that account was Margaret Hollis. Simone handed the financial records to Agent Webb on a Friday morning. He didn't say much. He looked at the numbers, looked at the signature authority documentation, and closed the folder with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who has just found exactly what he came looking for. The following Tuesday at 7:15 in the morning, 2 FBI vehicles pulled into Pinecrest Fairways. Black SUVs, clean, quiet, moving, with that particular unhurried certainty that only comes when everything is already decided and the paperwork is already signed. Margaret was walking to her white Cadillac when they arrived. Blazer on, binder in hand, coffee in the other. Special Agent Darius Webb stepped out and introduced himself. Margaret smiled. That same smile, warm, patient, absolute. She said, "I'm sure we can clear this up very quickly." Agent Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ma'am, I'd put the coffee down." She was charged with federal civil rights violations for the destruction of a protected burial site, wire fraud for the falsified maintenance invoices, and felony misappropriation of HOA funds. Charles Pruitt, her silver-haired expensive attorney, arrived 20 minutes later and said, "Nothing useful because there was nothing useful left to say." The neighborhood found out by 9 that morning. I was sitting on my porch with Celestine when Calvin called. I already knew. I had watched the SUVs from the end of the street. Celestine took my hand without saying anything. We sat there for a while in the quiet, in that particular Pinecrest morning air, pine resin, wet clay, the smell that had made us believe everything might be okay when we first arrived. It still smelled the same. Some things survive. The graves were gone. I want to be honest about that because I think you deserve the truth, and not just the satisfying part. 12 headstones. 127 years of history. You cannot fully restore what a backhoe removes in a single night, but here's what happened next. Allegheny County issued a formal preservation order for the entire northeast corner. A historical restoration team spent 4 months carefully excavating and documenting the site. The Whitmore family descendants, the Calloway family, and what remained of our family gathered on a Saturday morning in October when the new headstones were placed. Idame Okafor, new iron cross, same inscription, same spot. My father would have been 81 years old that October. I stood at that grave and thought about a quiet man parking on an access road and walking his son through hemlock trees without saying much. Because some things pass between people without words. I understood him better standing there than I ever had before. The twist? Margaret Hollis had been skimming HOA funds for 11 years. Not for 11, the full forensic audit uncovered. $230,000 in fraudulent disbursements across 3 separate accounts. Fake contractors. Inflated invoices. A landscaping company that existed only on paper and shared a mailing address with Margaret's sister in Harrisburg. She had been running Pinecrest Fairways like a personal account since the year she took office. The golf course she bulldozed graves to expand. She had a private agreement with the contractor for a 12% referral fee on the entire project. She didn't destroy Ida Mae's grave out of carelessness. She destroyed it for money. Margaret Hollis pleaded guilty on a Thursday morning in February. Sentencing was scheduled for April. Charles Pruitt billed her for the full engagement before the plea was entered, because that is the kind of man Charles Pruitt was. I was not in the courtroom. I was at the northeast corner of Pinecrest Fairways, standing at a clean iron cross in the quiet morning air. $11. A Bible, 2 children. She built something that lasted. Even Margaret Hollis couldn't take that.